Hello, and welcome to the Sleepy Curiosity channel. As you find a comfortable position, let your body begin to release the weight of the day. If this gentle journey is already starting to slow your thoughts, consider subscribing now, so these stories keep finding you night after night. Now, let the relaxation settle into your breathing. Every night, while you sleep, your brain builds an entire world from scratch, with no raw materials from the real world. No walls, no light, no sound coming from outside. Just the brain, alone, manufacturing scenarios, characters, emotions, and stories that feel completely real for as long as they last. The question seems to have an obvious answer, but it doesn't. What, exactly, is a dream? From a biological standpoint, the most widely accepted definition today is this: a dream is a spontaneous hallucination that occurs during sleep. That sounds strange at first. Hallucination is a word that carries weight, one that evokes something pathological, something outside the norm. But the difference between a pathological hallucination and a dream is simply context. During sleep, this state is expected, it's normal, and by all indications, it's necessary. The brain isn't failing when it dreams. It's doing exactly what it needs to do. What makes this fascinating is that the process is neither passive nor random. While you dream, specific regions of your brain become highly active, in some cases, more active than when you're awake. The visual cortex lights up. Areas tied to emotion come fully online. Memory systems begin working simultaneously, weaving experiences that can be indistinguishable from reality for as long as they last. And all of this happens with your eyes closed, your body still, the outside world completely shut out. This is where things start to get strange. The brain, receiving no sensory information from the environment, decides to create its own. It decides to build a world. And not just a vague outline, a world with texture, with emotion, with its own internal logic, with characters who speak and act in ways the dreamer never anticipated. A world that, while it exists, is just as real as anything you've ever experienced. Sleep is not a uniform state. That's something most people never learn in school, but it completely changes how you understand what happens during the night. While you sleep, your brain moves through cycles that repeat at intervals of roughly 90 minutes. Each cycle contains phases with very different characteristics, and understanding this structure is the key to understanding when and why dreams happen. These cycles fall into two broad categories. The first is NREM sleep, non-rapid eye movement, which dominates the early hours of the night and ranges from light sleep all the way to the deepest sleep the body is capable of reaching. The second is REM sleep, rapid eye movement, which appears later in each cycle and tends to stretch longer in the final hours of the night. It's during REM that most vivid dreams occur. That's why the dreams you remember most clearly are almost always the ones from the early morning hours, when REM episodes are already longer. And there's one detail that changes everything about this structure. In a healthy night of sleep, a person spends an average of 90 minutes to 2 hours in REM sleep, spread across multiple episodes throughout the night. That means dreaming isn't a rare or occasional event. It's a structural, recurring part of every night. You dream every single night, even if you don't remember it. Your brain is committed to this in a way that doesn't depend on your memory or your will. The name REM sleep describes only one of the most visible symptoms of this phase. The eyes move rapidly beneath closed eyelids, in patterns researchers are still studying. But what happens inside the brain during this period is far more complex than the name suggests. When early researchers observed brain activity patterns during REM using electroencephalography, there was a moment of genuine confusion. The patterns they were seeing were so similar to the waking state that they questioned whether the participants were actually asleep. During REM, the brain produces high-frequency, low-amplitude waves, the exact opposite of deep sleep, where the waves are slow and wide. It's a brain that looks awake, in electrical terms. But at the same time, something very specific happens to the body. The voluntary muscles become essentially paralyzed. This phenomenon has a technical name, muscle atonia, and it exists for a very clear functional reason. If your body physically carried out every movement you were living inside the dream, the consequences would be unpredictable. The paralysis is a safeguard. What seems simple isn't. Because when this protective mechanism partially fails, disorders emerge, like REM sleep behavior disorder. People with this condition get up, talk, gesture, run, all within a dream, with no awareness of any of it. Upon waking, they have no memory of the behavior. From their perspective, they were simply sleeping. From the perspective of anyone watching, they were living the dream in real time, with their body. One of the most sophisticated regions of the human brain is the prefrontal cortex. It manages logical reasoning, planning, self-criticism, your sense of who you are and what's possible. During wakefulness, it operates as a constant filter over everything you think and experience. During REM sleep, it's largely switched off. This reduction in activity directly explains something anyone who pays close attention to their own dreams has already noticed. In a dream, you accept completely absurd situations as if they were perfectly normal. You fly and don't question it. You're in an impossible place and feel no sense of strangeness. Someone who died years ago appears alive, talking to you, and it doesn't seem worth noting. The system responsible for spotting inconsistencies is temporarily offline. There's no one checking whether what's happening is plausible. This starts to get more interesting when you consider what happens in lucid dreams. The ability to realize, from inside the dream itself, that you're dreaming is directly tied to a partial reactivation of the prefrontal cortex. Neuroimaging studies have shown that lucid dreamers display significantly higher activity in this region compared to regular dreamers during REM. Lucid dreaming is a hybrid state. The brain is simultaneously in dream mode and in conscious reflection mode. Two conditions that don't normally coexist, happening at the same time in the same brain. Inside a dream, the brain doesn't just create an experience, it treats that experience as real. The neural systems that process real perceptions and imagined perceptions are, for the most part, the same. When you dream you're running, the motor areas of your brain activate as if you were actually running. When you dream of a frightening face, the amygdala, the brain's fear processing center, responds as if the threat were real. From the brain's perspective, there's no functional difference between fear in a dream and fear while awake. This happens because during a dream, the brain receives no external signals that could contradict what it's generating internally. Without that contrast, there's no immediate mechanism for distinguishing the constructed from the real. The subjective experience is, therefore, indistinguishable, at least while it lasts. You don't feel like you're dreaming because there's nothing within the system pointing to that conclusion. And what almost no one notices is that this has implications that go far beyond dreams. If the brain processes imagined perceptions and real perceptions using the same systems, that suggests the reality you experience while awake is also, to some degree, an active construction. The brain doesn't receive the world directly, it builds a representation of the world from sensory signals. The difference between dreaming and waking may be less absolute than it intuitively seems. The perception of time inside a dream is one of its most debated characteristics, and science has arrived at a conclusion that surprises most people. There's a popular idea that dreams can last only seconds, even when they feel like they went on for hours. But studies with lucid dreamers, who are able to communicate with researchers during the dream itself using prearranged eye movements, have shown something different. Subjective time within a dream is, in most cases, fairly close to real time. A dream that feels like it lasted 10 minutes typically occurs over about 10 minutes of REM sleep. The sense that dreams last much longer than they actually do seems to be, in part, an effect of memory upon waking, not a distortion that happens during the dream itself. What happens is that memory compresses and reorganizes, creating the impression of an extension that never existed during the dream. What really varies is the density of experience. In some dreams, the sense of continuity is high and the narrative flow feels uninterrupted. In others, there are abrupt scene jumps, sudden shifts in setting or characters, without the dreamer questioning any of it. The brain makes these edits automatically, cuts, changes scenes, picks up at a different point, and the discontinuity is rarely noticed from the inside. It's like watching a movie that skips scenes without warning, but you never notice anything was missing. Dreams don't come from nowhere. The brain uses available material, recent experiences, old memories, emotional concerns, and even physical stimuli from the environment to build what you'll experience during sleep. One of the most studied patterns in this construction is called day residue. Recent events, especially those with emotional weight, have a high likelihood of appearing in dreams the following night or the night after. But this doesn't happen literally. The brain often repackages these experiences in completely different contexts, using the associated emotions as raw material while swapping out the settings, the characters, the situations. The anxiety from a work meeting might show up as the anxiety of an exam you didn't study for. The joy of a reunion might emerge as the joy of a trip that never happened. The emotion is the central ingredient. The setting is just the packaging the brain chooses to process it. There's also a pattern that occurs roughly 5 to 7 days after a significant event, called the dream reminiscence effect. This suggests that the process of memory consolidation during sleep isn't instantaneous. It operates in cycles. And dreams may reflect this ongoing processing, returning to the material several days later, as if the brain is still working through something that wasn't fully resolved on the first night. The hippocampus is a small structure deep in the brain, and it's central to the formation of new memories. During wakefulness, it records experiences and organizes them. During sleep, it reactivates them and gradually transfers information to other regions for long-term storage. Dreams appear to be, in part, a visible window into this transfer process. Research with patients who suffered damage to the hippocampus revealed something remarkable. These individuals continue to dream, but their dreams lose their connection to recent events. The content becomes dominated by old memories or by more abstract, generic constructions. The hippocampus is especially important for bringing recent material into dreams, but it's not the only source of dream content. When it fails, the brain keeps dreaming. It just no longer knows where to find the new material. The practical implication of this is more direct than it might seem. Quality sleep, especially REM phases, appears to be necessary for the hippocampus to do its job efficiently. Depriving someone of REM sleep doesn't just reduce dreaming. It directly compromises the ability to consolidate what was learned or experienced. What you studied, that important conversation you had, that skill you practiced, all of it needs the night to truly stick. And dreams are part of that process. A very common assumption is that dreams are essentially visual. For most people who were born sighted, they are. But what happens with blind people? The answer reveals something important about how the brain constructs dream experiences, and about how much dreams are shaped by each person's individual sensory architecture. People who lost their vision after the ages of 5 to 7 continue to have dreams with visual imagery, though the frequency tends to decrease over time as visual memories age. People who have been blind since birth, or who lost their sight very early, never develop visual dreams. But that doesn't impoverish their dreams. Quite the opposite. Their dreams are dominated by auditory, tactile, olfactory, and movement-based experiences, often described as highly vivid, sometimes more intense than the visual dreams described by sighted people. This shows that the brain doesn't have a standard format for dreams. It uses whatever sensory systems are available and active. Dreams are built from the architecture of each individual mind, not from a universal template that everyone shares. The dream of someone born blind and the dream of someone who has always had sight are radically different experiences, even if both are processing the same emotions. Despite dreams often involving places, people, and detailed situations, there's something that almost never appears in them: smell. The vast majority of people report rarely or never having olfactory experiences inside dreams, even when the settings described, a bakery, a forest, a beach right after rain, would naturally be associated with strong odors in waking life. The most widely accepted explanation lies in brain anatomy. The human olfactory system has a direct, primitive connection to the limbic system, especially the amygdala and hippocampus, but its integration with the cortical regions that dominate dreaming appears to be less active during REM sleep. In evolutionary terms, smell is one of the oldest senses, and its absence from dreams may simply reflect how different brain regions are prioritized during this state. What shouldn't happen, but does? People with damage to certain areas of the frontal lobe report smells in dreams more frequently than average. This suggests that under normal conditions, some active mechanism suppresses olfactory experience during dreaming. It isn't simply a passive absence. It's a suppression. Something in the brain is deliberately keeping smell out, and when that mechanism is removed by an injury, smells start appearing in dreams again. Lucid dreaming is the state in which a person, while inside a dream, clearly realizes they're asleep. And in some cases, they can exert some control over what happens. For decades, this phenomenon was treated with skepticism by the scientific community. The problem was simple: how do you prove that someone is conscious inside a dream, when the only available evidence is a report given after waking? The solution arrived in an elegant form. In 1975, researcher Keith Hearn, and later, more widely documented, Stephen LaBerge of Stanford, demonstrated that lucid dreamers could communicate with the outside world during REM sleep using prearranged eye movements. Before falling asleep, the dreamer and the researcher would agree on a signal. 2 eye movements to the left would mean "I'm lucid now, I'm conscious inside the dream." And the recording showed exactly that, with the electroencephalogram confirming that the participant was in deep REM sleep at the same time. This proved, in an objective and measurable way, that lucidity inside a dream was a neurologically real state. Not a confabulation after waking, not a distorted memory. A verifiable, documentable, reproducible in the lab state. And the neuroimaging studies that followed confirmed that this state involves a partial reactivation of the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for critical thinking and self-awareness, while the rest of the brain remains in dream mode. Recurring dreams are reported by a surprisingly large proportion of the population. Studies estimate that between 60 and 75% of adults have had a dream that repeated itself over time, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. And the content tends to be negatively charged. Chases, falls, situations of failure or danger are far more common in recurring dreams than pleasant scenes. The most robust explanation science offers is tied to incomplete emotional processing. When an experience with strong emotional weight isn't adequately processed during sleep, when the nightly work of integration can't finish what it started, the brain seems to return to that material repeatedly, as if it's trying to complete something left unfinished. The recurring dream would be, from this perspective, a signal that something hasn't been integrated yet. Not a punishment. An attempt. And there's a detail here that changes everything. In many reported cases, when the life situation associated with the dream changes, a decision finally made, a conflict resolved, a life transition completed, the recurring dream simply stops appearing. Without deliberate intervention, without specific therapy, without any conscious effort. The brain recognizes that the work is done and drops the subject. As if it knew, before the dreamer did, that this no longer needs to be processed. Sleep paralysis is an experience that combines two states that normally shouldn't coexist, the consciousness of wakefulness and the muscle paralysis of REM sleep. Those who go through it wake up, or believe they've woken up, but can't move their body, can't speak, can't react. And they frequently sense the presence of something or someone in the room. The experience can last from a few seconds to a few minutes and is, for most people, deeply unsettling. What happens neurologically is an incomplete transition between REM sleep and wakefulness. The brain begins to emerge from sleep, but the muscle atonia mechanism isn't deactivated in time. The result is a window in which consciousness returns but motor control doesn't. The person is awake enough to notice they can't move, but the body is still locked in sleep. What makes this phenomenon culturally fascinating is that different cultures around the world developed explanations for it completely independently of one another. The European night demon. The ghost sitting on the chest in Chinese tradition. The witch riding in Brazilian folklore. The night hag in African cultures. All of them describe, with local variations in detail and narrative, the same physiological experience. Sleep paralysis may be one of the common origins of myths about nocturnal entities across cultures that never had any contact with each other. The same biological event being interpreted, across millennia, through completely different cultural frameworks. There's a state that occurs exactly on the border between being awake and falling asleep, one that produces experiences just as vivid as dreams, but with one important difference: the person still has some degree of consciousness. This state is called hypnagogia, and its equivalent upon waking goes by the name hypnopompia. During hypnagogia, the brain begins generating images, sounds, sensations, and even voices while consciousness hasn't fully switched off yet. It's common to hear your own name being called, with a startling clarity. To see faces that appear and disappear, sometimes completely unfamiliar, sometimes extraordinarily detailed. Or to experience the sudden sensation of falling, the so-called hypnagogic jerk, which jolts the person awake with a racing heart. Some researchers believe hypnagogia was deliberately used by historical figures like Thomas Edison and Salvador Dali to access altered creative states. The technique described by both is curiously similar: fall asleep holding a heavy object, a metal key, a spoon. The moment sleep deepens enough for the hand to go slack, the object falls, the noise wakes the person up, and the hypnagogic images are captured before they dissolve. It's a way of deliberately surfing the border between the two states, harvesting whatever surfaces there. One of the most intriguing theories about the function of dreams doesn't come from psychoanalysis or clinical neurology. It comes from evolutionary psychology. The threat simulation theory proposes that dreams exist, in part, because for millennia they were a concrete survival advantage. The core idea is that the dream environment would function as a simulator for dangerous situations. The brain would practice responses to threats with no real risk. It would test strategies, rehearse reactions, and the fact that nightmares and dreams involving chases, falls, or danger are universally common, and appear with high frequency in young children, who have little experience with real threats, would be consistent with this hypothesis. The child doesn't need to have been chased to dream of being chased. The program comes pre-installed. Cross-cultural studies show that threatening content in dreams is significantly more frequent than threatening events in those same people's waking lives, which suggests the brain isn't simply replaying what it lived. It's generating training scenarios. It's preparing for something that hasn't happened yet, like a soldier who trains for situations they hope to never face but need to be ready for. The theory doesn't explain all dreams, but it offers an evolutionary reason why disturbing dreams are so common and so difficult to eliminate. One function of dreams that has gained strong scientific support in recent decades is emotional processing. REM sleep appears to serve the purpose of reprocessing emotionally charged experiences in a way that reduces their effective impact over time. Neuroscientist Matthew Walker describes this as a kind of nightly therapy, a processing session that happens every night, without needing to be scheduled, without requiring consciousness, without needing anything from you beyond sleep. The proposed mechanism involves a peculiar chemical characteristic of REM sleep. During this phase, levels of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter associated with stress and the alerting response, drop to their lowest point in the entire 24-hour cycle. This would create a window in which the brain can reactivate emotional memories in a calmer neurochemical environment. It can revisit what was difficult without the physiological cost of stress. It can process the content without being overwhelmed by it. The clearest clinical evidence for this theory comes from people with post-traumatic stress disorder. In these individuals, REM sleep is frequently disrupted, and the nightmares that occur within it don't follow the normal pattern of gradually decreasing in intensity. Instead, the traumatic memory seems to be reactivated repeatedly without being processed. Like a file the computer keeps trying to open but can't. The system fails, starts over, fails again. And the experience remains just as vivid and just as painful as it was on the first day. The relationship between dreams and memory is one of the most active areas in sleep neuroscience. The central hypothesis is that REM sleep is necessary for converting recent, fragile memories into lasting records. And that dreams may be not just byproducts of this process, but an active part of it, not merely the noise of a working machine, but the machine itself. Classic learning experiments showed that performance on motor and cognitive tasks improves significantly after a night of sleep, more than after an equivalent period of wakefulness. And when REM sleep is specifically suppressed, that improvement doesn't happen, even when other sleep stages are preserved. It's not just the rest that matters. It's the REM. It's that specific phase, with its dreams and its intense brain activity, that makes the difference. And there's a detail that deepens this relationship in a way that's hard to ignore. Some participants in learning studies reported dreams containing elements of the tasks they had practiced, mazes they had navigated, musical sequences they had studied, specific movements they had trained. And those who reported these task-related dreams consistently showed better performance the following day than those who didn't. The dream, in those cases, wasn't just a passive companion to consolidation. It was an indicator that consolidation was actively occurring. A signal that the work was being done. The idea that sleeping on a problem helps solve it isn't just folklore. Science provides reasonable evidence that sleep, particularly the phases that include dreaming, can facilitate connections between pieces of information that, during wakefulness, seem completely unrelated. The sleeping brain, freed from linear logic, appears capable of seeing patterns that the waking brain misses. A study conducted by researchers at the University of Lübeck showed that participants who slept between 2 sessions of a complex math problem were almost 3 times more likely to discover a hidden shortcut in the solution than those who stayed awake for the same period. It's not that sleep gave them the answer. It's that sleep reorganized their mental representations of the problem in a way that made the answer visible. Dreams contribute to this by freely combining elements from different memories, without the logical coherence required during wakefulness. This seemingly random combination can occasionally generate new and useful associations. The chemist Auguste Kekulé reported discovering the ring structure of benzene after dreaming of a snake biting its own tail. Paul McCartney claimed to have heard the complete melody of Yesterday in a dream, woken up immediately, and played it on the piano before it could slip away. The dream, in these cases, didn't create from nothing. It reorganized what was already there, in a way that wakefulness hadn't managed to. Most people forget almost all of their dreams. Studies suggest that up to 95% of dream content dissolves within the first few minutes after waking. And even the dreams remembered upon waking tend to fade quickly if they aren't spoken aloud or written down right away. Why does the brain seem so efficient at erasing something it just created with such detail and intensity? The explanation involves 2 neurotransmitters with opposing functions during sleep. During REM, there's high acetylcholine activity and very low levels of norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is essential for consolidating long-term memories. Without it, dream experiences don't go through the process needed to become lasting recollections, and they simply dissolve, like smoke in the air. But there's a complementary hypothesis that is, perhaps, even more interesting. Maybe forgetting dreams is functional. If every dream experience, including the most absurd, the most disturbing, the most emotionally intense, were retained with the same clarity as real memories, it could create a progressive confusion between what was lived and what was only dreamed. The systematic forgetting of dreams may be a way of preserving the integrity of autobiographical memory, of knowing who you are and what actually happened to you. The erasure may be a form of protection. When researchers began systematically cataloging dream content in large population samples, a consistent pattern emerged. Men and women tend to dream in slightly different ways, not in intensity or frequency, but in content and in the social structure of the narratives. Men's dreams, on average, feature more unknown characters, more outdoor settings, and more situations involving physical conflict. Women's dreams tend to include more familiar characters, more indoor environments, and more emotionally complex interactions. These differences appear consistently in cross-cultural studies, which suggests they're not simply reflections of social roles specific to any one culture. They may have roots in more fundamental differences in emotional and social processing. One additional finding, Both sexes dream more about characters of their own sex than of the opposite sex. But this tendency is more pronounced in men. The interpretation is still debated, but the pattern is robust enough to appear repeatedly in independent research conducted across completely different countries and cultural contexts. The experience of dreaming changes considerably across a lifetime. And these changes reflect both neurological development and the shifts in concerns and emotional structure at each stage. Dreams grow with you, in specific and measurable ways. Young children, between the ages of 2 and 5, do dream, but their dreams are remarkably different from adults. They tend to be static, with few characters, and without the dreamer themselves as an active protagonist. The complex narrative and first-person perspective that characterize adult dreams only appear gradually, as cognitive development advances. This suggests that the ability to be the protagonist of a dream is tied to the development of self-awareness, and isn't innate. The child first needs to learn that they are an I before they can be the hero of their own dreams. In older adults, dreams tend to feature more memories from the distant past, fewer contemporary characters, and in many cases, a greater presence of people who have already died. Emotional intensity decreases slightly with age, as does the frequency of nightmares. But dreams about loss and separation become more common. Dreams seem to function as a dynamic mirror of the psychological state of each life stage, reflecting not just what's happening now, but what's most present, most heavy, closest to the surface. Some medications have such pronounced effects on dreams that patients discontinue them on their own without fully understanding why. Simply because the dreams became unbearably vivid, disturbing, or just impossible to ignore. The impact of substances on dream content and intensity is a field with direct clinical implications, and one that still surprises many healthcare professionals. Antidepressants in the class of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors suppress REM sleep, especially in the first weeks of use. Dreams decrease during treatment. But when the medication is discontinued, a phenomenon called REM rebound occurs. REM sleep returns with increased intensity, producing exceptionally vivid and frequent dreams for days or weeks. Like a dam that breaks after holding back water for too long. Other compounds with documented effects include melatonin in high doses and transdermal nicotine patches, both associated with noticeably more intense dreams, possibly because nicotine stimulates receptors that directly influence REM sleep. And beta blockers, used for blood pressure, have the opposite effect. They can suppress dreams almost entirely, leaving nights in a silence that many patients describe as unsettling in its own right. The absence of dreams, when it happens abruptly, carries its own weight. Sleep deprivation produces well-documented effects on cognitive and emotional functioning. But its impact on dreams follows a logic that, at first glance, seems contradictory. You'd expect less sleep to mean fewer dreams. In practice, the opposite happens. This phenomenon is called REM pressure. The longer REM sleep is delayed or suppressed, the stronger the brain's tendency to compensate at the next sleep opportunity. Dreams become more vivid, more emotionally intense, and harder to distinguish from reality upon waking, the exact opposite of what you might expect from an exhausted brain. The system that was deprived pushes back with more force. In extreme cases of prolonged deprivation, the brain may begin inserting micro-episodes of REM sleep during wakefulness, a state called REM intrusion. Visual and auditory hallucinations while awake can be, in these cases, literally fragments of dreams invading waking consciousness. The wall separating the dream from reality begins to crack. And through the gap, the dream seeps into the waking world. The question of whether animals dream seems simple, but answering it required decades of careful research. REM sleep has been identified in every mammal studied, as well as in birds. In rats, remarkable experiments showed that during sleep, the hippocampus replays sequences of neural activation identical to those observed while the animals navigated mazes while awake, as if the brain were retracing the path. In some cases, this replay was detailed enough that researchers could identify which part of the maze the rat was dreaming about. Octopuses produced an even more surprising finding. Researchers observed rapid color changes in the skin during sleep, in patterns that resembled the changes used during hunting while awake. Whether this represents something equivalent to dreaming in an animal with a nervous system radically different from mammals, and without a cerebral cortex, is still debated. But the observation raised serious questions about how fundamental and ancient the capacity to dream may be in the evolutionary history of animals. And what almost no one notices is what this implies about us. If the capacity to process experiences during sleep exists in animals so different from humans, that suggests it isn't a late evolutionary luxury. It's something far older. Something that evolution discovered long ago and didn't want to give up. A function so useful it was preserved across hundreds of millions of years of change. Nightmares are so common that they're rarely treated as something that deserves explanation. But the fact that the brain generates experiences of terror, humiliation, or danger while the body is in complete safety is, when examined closely, quite peculiar. Why would the brain do this to itself? The most robust theory connects nightmares to the emotional regulation function of REM sleep. Nightmares may represent the brain's attempt to deal with emotional material that's too difficult to process smoothly. The disturbing content would be, from this perspective, not a system failure, but a proportional response to the intensity of what needs to be processed. The system is working, it's just working under heavy load. Chronic nightmares are different from occasional ones. They appear with high prevalence in people with post-traumatic stress disorder, severe anxiety, and depression, and seem to reflect a dysfunction in the normal process of emotional regulation during sleep. There's now a specific therapy for recurring nightmares called image rehearsal therapy. The person, while awake, rewrites the ending of the nightmare repeatedly, creating a different version, a version where something changes, where something gets resolved. And this process, over time, alters the content of the dream itself. The waking mind rewriting the script of the sleeping mind. Inside a dream, fear can be just as intense as any fear experienced while awake. Neuroimaging studies show that the amygdala, the brain's central structure for fear processing, is one of the most active regions during REM sleep. Often more active than during normal wakefulness. The fear in a nightmare isn't a weak simulation of real fear. It's the same system, activated at the same intensity. Heart rate increases. Breathing quickens. Hormonal responses are triggered. All of this happens with the body lying still and motionless, the outside world completely quiet. From a physiological standpoint, the fear felt in a nightmare is real. Only its object isn't. The amygdala appears to play a role not only in generating fear inside the dream, but in determining which emotional memories are prioritized for processing during REM. This creates a cycle with its own logic. The experiences that strongly activated the amygdala during the day are more likely to appear in dreams, and to appear with heightened emotional intensity. What affected us most during waking is what the brain most wants to work through during sleep. The difficulty of the day becomes the work of the night. The loss of someone close frequently changes sleep patterns in well-documented ways. But there's a specific grief phenomenon that receives less attention, and that is, for many people, deeply significant, vivid dreams of the deceased, especially in the weeks and months following a loss. These grief dreams have characteristics distinct from ordinary dreams. They tend to be more vivid, more emotionally intense, and more easily remembered upon waking. In many cases, the deceased person appears alive, healthy, and present, which can produce, upon waking, a fresh wave of grief when the realization comes that it was only a dream. For others, these same dreams are described as comforting. A way of staying close. A final visit the brain allows, even knowing it shouldn't be possible. Research on grief suggests that these dreams may have an adaptive function, part of the process by which the brain reorganizes attachment patterns and integrates the absence of the person into the structure of memories and expectations. What was lost in the real world continues to exist in the dream world for a time. And that time, it seems, may be necessary. One of the most recent and striking discoveries about dreams comes from neuroimaging studies that observed what happens in the moments just before waking. Researchers identified a pattern of brain activity that occurs consistently in the final seconds before a person wakes, a kind of accelerated replay of the dream content that just took place. This replay appears to be the mechanism by which the memory of the dream is transferred to a state more accessible to waking consciousness. But the irony is that it happens precisely when sleep is about to end. Which means the dreams you remember upon waking may be, in large part, the ones that were summarized in that final moment, and not necessarily the longest or most significant ones from the standpoint of processing. If that's correct, the dream you remember upon waking may be nothing more than the final scene of a much longer film, one you only catch the closing credits of. The more elaborate content, the deeper processing, may have occurred hours earlier, and vanished completely without leaving any accessible trace. What you remember may be the least important part. What you forgot may have been the real work. In 2013, Japanese researchers at the ATR Institute used functional MRI combined with machine learning algorithms to identify broad categories of visual content in dreams, just by analyzing brain activity patterns of participants while they slept. The process worked by training the algorithm on participants' brain patterns during wakefulness, while they looked at images, and then applying that model to sleep. The result wasn't dream reading in the cinematic sense. It wasn't possible to watch what someone was dreaming like a movie. But the ability to identify whether someone was dreaming of an outdoor environment versus a human face, using only brain data, represented a genuine methodological leap. It opened a possibility that had previously existed only as science fiction. And there's a detail that changes everything about this line of research. In trying to build dream decoding systems, researchers discovered more about how the brain organizes visual information than in decades of previous studies. Sometimes the attempt to read the sleeping mind reveals more about how the mind works than any other approach could have managed. Studies have shown that sounds played during REM sleep can be incorporated into dream content with surprising frequency. Participants who heard a person's name during sleep reported, upon waking, dreams in which that person appeared. Sounds of rain were associated with dreams set in outdoor rainy environments. The outside world, even when blocked by sleep, finds its way through the cracks. A research project called Dormio, developed at the MIT Media Lab, went further and created a device that monitors the hypnagogic state, the transition into sleep, and plays content suggestions at exactly this window of high receptivity. The initial results showed it was possible to direct specific themes into participants' hypnagogic thoughts with a remarkable success rate. The most immediate implication isn't dream control in any fantastical sense. It's the possibility of using this state of high plasticity, this window between waking and sleeping, for learning, for creativity, for therapeutic processing. The hypnagogic state, which most people pass through without noticing every single night, may be one of the most underutilized cognitive resources there is. Consciousness is one of the hardest problems in science. And dreams are at the center of that problem. During a dream, there's subjective experience, there's something it's like to be that person in that moment. The brain is disconnected from the external world, the prefrontal cortex is partially inactive, long-term memory isn't consolidating normally. And yet the experience is happening. With all its texture, with all its emotional weight. Some philosophers and neuroscientists use dreams as an argument against theories of consciousness that tie it exclusively to the processing of external information or to prefrontal cortex activity. If there's conscious experience during dreams, and the consistent reports from people upon waking suggest there is, then consciousness can occur under conditions very different from those of normal wakefulness, without requiring all the elements we typically associate with it. Lucid dreaming complicates this question in an even more interesting way. In it, there's metacognition, thinking about one's own thinking, within a state of sleep. This suggests that different degrees and types of consciousness can coexist or alternate within a single sleep episode, challenging any definition that treats consciousness as something simply present or absent, like a light that's either on or off. Reality seems to be far more gradual, far more fluid than that. REM sleep behavior disorder deserves a closer look for what it reveals about the architecture of dreams. Under normal conditions, muscle atonia during REM sleep ensures the body stays still while the brain lives through intense dream experiences. In this disorder, that mechanism fails. The muscles aren't paralyzed, and the person acts physically inside the dream. The result can involve behaviors ranging from talking and gesturing to sitting up, getting out of bed, running, all without any awareness of what's happening. Upon waking, the absence of memory is nearly total. There's no disturbing dream to report. Only the account of whoever was awake watching. What makes this disorder scientifically significant beyond its clinical relevance is its association with neurodegenerative diseases. Long-term studies have shown that a very high proportion of people with this disorder, in some studies, above 80%, go on to develop diseases like Parkinson's or Lewy body dementia years or decades later. The failure in the atonia mechanism may be an early sign of neurodegeneration, a warning that appears during sleep years before any cognitive symptoms become visible during wakefulness. Dreams, in these cases, function as a window for early diagnosis of something that hasn't arrived yet. In schizophrenia, dreams tend to be more fragmented, with less coherent narrative and more experiences of passivity, the sense that actions in the dream are being controlled by external forces. This pattern mirrors some of the waking symptoms of schizophrenia, suggesting that the same mechanisms that produce waking hallucinations and delusions also distort the dream experience. Disturbed dreaming and disturbed wakefulness, in these cases, appear to be produced by the same process. In bipolar disorder, dreams during manic phases tend to be more elaborate, more positive, and more grandiose. During depressive phases, the content becomes more opaque, more passive, and frequently marked by themes of loss. The mood state of the moment leaves its mark on the dream with a fidelity that no conscious self-report could capture with the same precision. This opens a possibility that researchers are beginning to explore. Monitoring dream patterns could, in theory, provide information about a patient's current emotional state with more nuance than a simple interview. The dream as a clinical instrument. What happens during sleep as diagnostic data for what happens during waking? Body temperature and ambient temperature have a more direct influence on dreams than most people realize. During REM sleep, the body temporarily loses much of its ability to thermoregulate. Unlike deep sleep, during which the body continues to actively adjust its temperature, in REM the thermal control is largely suspended. The dreamer temporarily becomes dependent on the external environment, in a way that's somewhat similar to a cold-blooded animal. But the effect goes beyond disrupting sleep. Studies have shown that thermal stimuli applied during sleep can be incorporated into dream content in recognizable ways. Heat applied to the feet was associated with dreams in warm or tropical environments. Cold was associated with dreams in icy environments or with feelings of physical discomfort. The physical body, even motionless and asleep, keeps sending signals. And the dreaming brain interprets those signals and weaves them into the narrative it's building. The physical and the dreamlike are in constant conversation, even when everything seems completely still. One well-documented and rarely discussed observation is that human faces in dreams are never entirely invented. The brain doesn't have the ability to generate a completely new face from scratch. Every face that appears in a dream is based on real faces the person has seen at some point in their life, even if they don't recognize them. The dream characters who seem completely unknown are, in fact, composites or variations of real faces stored in memory, recombined in ways that make the result unrecognizable. The database of real faces serves as raw material, but the final product can be different enough from the originals to seem entirely new. The stranger who appears in your dream has a face that belongs, in some measure, to someone you've actually seen. This reveals something about the nature of imagination in general. Human creativity, even in the dream state, where logical censorship is reduced, seems to always operate from existing material. Recombining, transforming, reorganizing, but never truly creating from nothing. The most impossible and surrealist dreams are, in the end, elaborate collages of real experiences. The impossible is always made from the possible. Crying during sleep, waking up with tears on your face and no clear memory of a disturbing dream, is a phenomenon reported frequently enough to have been studied. And its explanation sheds light on important aspects of the relationship between emotion and memory in dreams. What the studies suggest is that the emotional response and the narrative memory of the dream can be dissociated. The limbic system can remain active and produce intense physical responses even when the cortex doesn't consolidate the dream content in an accessible way. The result is an emotion without a story. the body carries the emotional trace of something the mind didn't hold on to. You wake up with the weight of something you can't name. This suggests that emotional processing during sleep may occur in layers, some of which never reach waking consciousness. A completely forgotten dream may have contributed to the processing of something difficult, without leaving any accessible trace. The absence of memory isn't the absence of effect. The work may have been done even without you knowing it was. Meditation and contemplative practices have been associated with documented changes in sleep and dream patterns. Experienced meditators, especially those with thousands of hours of practice, show REM sleep patterns distinct from non-meditators. Some studies have found a higher frequency of spontaneous lucid dreams, without any specific induction technique, suggesting that mindfulness training during wakefulness may facilitate the maintenance of awareness during sleep. Tibetan Buddhist traditions developed specific practices called dream yoga, which treat the dream state as a terrain for deliberate spiritual practice. Cultivating lucidity within dreams as an extension of meditative practice. What's remarkable is that regardless of the spiritual context, these practices describe techniques, recognizing the dream state, stabilizing consciousness within the dream, deliberately transforming the content, that align surprisingly well with what scientific research on lucid dreaming has confirmed to be possible. This creates an interesting convergence. Traditions that developed these practices centuries ago, with no scientific apparatus, arrived at descriptions of the dream state that modern neuroscience is only beginning to confirm. As if, through careful observation of one's own experience, it's possible to reach conclusions that the scientific method would take far longer to arrive at. One of the most open questions in the science of dreams isn't technical or methodological. It's conceptual. If dreams have clear and important functions, emotional processing, memory consolidation, threat simulation, why are they so frequently absurd, incoherent, and narratively chaotic? Wouldn't an efficient emotional processing machine produce more organized experiences? This tension has generated two lines of thinking. The first proposes that the apparent absurdity of dreams is superficial, that beneath the chaotic narrative there's a coherent emotional logic the brain is following, even if it's not accessible to conscious reason. The second proposes that some dream content is simply noise, an inevitable byproduct of a highly active system, with no specific function beyond reflecting the general state of the brain at that moment. The most honest answer science currently offers is that both perspectives probably capture something true. Some dreams seem to have a clear functional structure. Others seem to genuinely be random combinations of memory fragments with no discernible purpose. The difficulty lies in telling them apart, especially because the human mind is extraordinarily good at finding meaning even where none exists. And dreams are a particularly fertile ground for that tendency. When a dream character says something the dreamer didn't expect, reveals information that seems new, reacts in a surprising way. It suggests that parts of the brain are generating content independently of other parts. The dreamer and the scriptwriter of the dream appear to be, in some measure, separate entities within the same brain. This observation connects to contemporary debates about the architecture of the mind. The idea that consciousness is just one of many voices in a distributed system, and not necessarily the one with the most control, finds in dreams a particularly clear illustration. The dreaming brain is a system that surprises itself with its own productions. That finds funny what it itself created. That feels afraid of what it itself fabricated. This says something profound about the limits of self-knowledge even at the most basic level. The COVID-19 pandemic produced a collective dream phenomenon so pronounced that researchers from different countries began documenting it independently and nearly simultaneously. People around the world reported, during periods of lockdown, dreams that were more vivid, more frequent, more disturbing, and more easily remembered than at any previous point in their lives. The explanation has multiple layers. Social isolation profoundly disrupted sleep routines. Widespread anxiety provided abundant emotional material for dream processing. And the reduction in external stimulation, fewer commutes, fewer social interactions, fewer new events, may have increased the proportion of internal material being processed during sleep. With less world out there, there was more world in here. Content analyses of dreams reported during the pandemic showed consistent patterns across countries and cultures. Dreams of invasion, invisible barriers, the inability to touch people close to you. The symbolic content mirrored, sometimes literally and sometimes abstractly, the objective psychological conditions of the moment. It was, involuntarily, one of the largest natural studies on how collective events translate into individual dream experience. The entire world, dreaming together about the same fear, each one in their own private theater. Virtual reality is creating situations that previously existed only as thought experiments. When someone spends enough time in an immersive virtual reality environment, the brain begins incorporating that environment into their dreams. Sometimes with surprising fidelity. Preliminary studies with regular VR users showed that dreams featuring elements from the virtual environments they frequented were reported with increasing frequency the greater the immersion time. The brain appears to have no reliable mechanism for flagging virtual experiences as fundamentally different from real experiences during memory consolidation. The most unsettling implication is this: if the nervous system treats memories of sufficiently immersive virtual environments in a way similar to memories of real environments, then the distinction between real and virtual may be less neurologically robust than it intuitively seems. And dreams may be one of the first places where that fragility shows itself. Where the virtual and the real blend in a way the brain can no longer separate. The impact of dreams on mood throughout the following day is more substantial than is generally recognized. Waking from an intense nightmare doesn't just affect your mood in the first hours of the morning, it can influence emotional processing, stress reactivity, and even decision-making for hours after waking, even when the dream's content has been completely forgotten. The mechanism involves the same emotional regulation systems that operate during REM sleep. If emotional processing during REM was disrupted, the following day begins with a regulation deficit that can manifest as greater irritability, lower frustration tolerance, and more intense emotional responses to events that, under normal conditions, would be handled with ease. The inverse also seems true. Waking after a night with emotionally positive or neutral dreams, even without remembering the content, is associated with better morning mood and greater emotional resilience throughout the day. What happens during sleep doesn't stay in sleep. It crosses the threshold of waking and enters the day, silently shaping how you'll experience everything that comes next. People who speak more than one language, in which language do they dream? The answer reveals something about how language is organized in the brain, and about the relationship between language, identity, and emotion. Studies with bilingual and multilingual people show that the language appearing in dreams isn't random. The language that surfaces most often tends to be the one with the greatest emotional weight for the dreamer, usually the mother tongue, especially when associated with childhood, family, and early emotional experiences. Even people who have spent decades using a second language as their primary language for work and daily life report frequently dreaming in their native language when the dream's content is emotionally intense. The native language and languages learned later occupy partially distinct neural networks, with different degrees of integration with the limbic system, which handles emotion. A language learned in childhood is deeply intertwined with emotional memories. Languages learned later have more cognitive and less effective representations. Dreams, which prioritize emotional processing, follow this hierarchy. They know, somehow, which language the emotion actually lives in. The identity a person holds inside their own dreams is, in many cases, different from the identity they experience while awake. In dreams, people frequently act in ways that contradict their conscious values, feel emotions they suppress while awake, and take on roles they would never consider for themselves. Many people report dreams in which they aren't themselves, in which they inhabit the body, the perspective, and sometimes even the identity of a completely different person. In these dreams, there's a continuity of consciousness. The I is still experiencing the dream, but the I that acts is someone else. The observer and the protagonist come apart. You watch yourself being someone else. This phenomenon raises difficult questions about what constitutes identity within a subjective experience. About exactly where the I resides when the body and the social context that normally anchor it are absent. In the dream, stripped of mirrors, stripped of others to reflect back who you are, the I drifts in a way that isn't possible while awake. And sometimes, in that drifting, something surfaces that wakefulness kept carefully contained. There's a type of dream reported with enough frequency to deserve more scientific attention than it typically receives: the flying dream. Dreaming that you're flying, especially in a controlled, free, and pleasant way, is one of the most universally positive dream experiences reported, and it appears in cross-cultural studies with remarkable consistency. One hypothesis links flying dreams to vestibular sensations during REM sleep. The inner balance system, without stable input from the external environment, may generate sensations of movement and floating that the brain interprets as flight. Another hypothesis suggests that flying in dreams is associated with states of high agency and freedom, emotions the brain would represent spatially as elevation and unrestricted movement. What's particularly interesting is that flying dreams appear with increased frequency during periods of positive life transition, new opportunities, recent accomplishments, the feeling of having overcome obstacles. As if the brain chose this specific form, the body freed from gravity, open space in every direction, to represent an emotional state that has no other language quite as fitting. The freedom that doesn't fit into words, expressed as a body in the air. How the content of human dreams has changed throughout history is impossible to track directly, but the available data offers clues. What appears not to change are the deep emotional structures: being chased, falling, loss, reunion, protecting the vulnerable, encounters with the unknown. These themes appear in dream records from radically different cultures and historical periods. What changes is the scenery, the characters, and the objects, the vocabulary of dreams. What remains are the emotional grammars, the fundamental narrative structures that organize how the brain processes experiences of threat, connection, loss, and opportunity. A human from the Paleolithic likely didn't dream of smartphones. But they likely dreamed of being chased, of loss, and of protection with the same frequency as anyone who falls asleep tonight. Beneath the enormous variation in content that history and culture produce, there's a human dream architecture that is far older than any civilization. That continues operating, night after night, essentially unchanged. As if, beneath everything we've learned and everything we've changed, the brain is still doing the same work it was doing 100,000 years ago. Processing the same losses. Rehearsing the same fears. Reaching for the same connections. There's a connection between dreams and neurodegenerative diseases that researchers have been investigating as a possible source of early biomarkers. Alzheimer's involves the progressive accumulation of abnormal proteins in specific brain regions. And deep sleep appears to be one of the main mechanisms by which the brain removes these metabolic waste products, through the glymphatic system, a network of channels that expands during sleep and allows for the clearing of substances that accumulate during wakefulness. Longitudinal studies have shown that people who report dreams with more confused or disoriented content, or greater difficulty distinguishing dreams from reality, in middle age show, decades later, a higher risk of developing dementia. This doesn't establish causation, but it opens the possibility that dream quality could one day be included in risk assessments for diseases that currently have no effective early diagnosis. What the brain does during the night, silently, may be telling us about what's happening to it far in advance of anything a clinical exam can detect. Dreams as early warning. Sleep as a diagnosis no one has learned to read yet. The question of whether there's something all dreams have in common, beyond being productions of the brain during sleep, is difficult to answer. But there's one characteristic that cuts across cultures, ages, neurological conditions, and historical contexts with a consistency worth noting: dreams carry emotion. Even dreams that seem narratively neutral, dreams of mundane situations, of daily routines, often have an emotional coloring that's hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. A sense of urgency without a clear cause. An atmosphere of familiarity or strangeness that the content alone doesn't explain. An emotional presence that lingers even after the story dissolves. This suggests that emotion isn't an incidental companion to dreams. It may be their most fundamental ingredient. The dreaming brain is, above all, an emotional processor. And everything else, the settings, the characters, the absurd or elaborate narratives, may simply be the form that processing finds to make itself experienceable. There's a question that runs through all the science of dreams and remains without a satisfying answer. Why are dreams experienced, rather than simply processed? Why is there something it's like to dream, a subjective experience, with texture and emotion and perspective, rather than simply silent neural activity carrying out its functions? This question is a version of the hardest problem of consciousness. And dreams are one of the most productive territories for exploring it, because during a dream, consciousness seems to operate differently but no less really. With less control, with less logical coherence, but with a quality of presence that is undeniable to anyone who experiences it. Maybe the answer, if it ever comes, won't come from any single technology. Maybe it'll come from the convergence of neuroscience, philosophy, phenomenology, and contemplative practices, from people who study the brain from the outside and people who study the mind from the inside. Dreams may be the territory where those approaches have the most to gain from meeting. The history of humanity is, in part, a history of people trying to make sense of their dreams. In every known culture, with no exception identified by anthropologists. The oldest records of dream interpretation date back approximately 4,000 years and come from Mesopotamia, Sumerian and Babylonian clay tablets describing the dreams of royal figures and their interpretations. In ancient Egypt, there were temples dedicated specifically to dream incubation, the practice of sleeping in sacred locations with the intention of receiving divine guidance during sleep. The Chester Beatty Papyrus, dated to around 1275 BCE, contains one of the earliest known dream interpretation manuals, with classifications and meanings assigned to hundreds of types of dreams. A manual for navigating the mind's nocturnal territory. What's remarkable about these ancient practices isn't just the belief itself. It's the sophistication of the classification systems that different cultures developed, without any contact with one another. This convergence suggests that the attempt to make sense of dreams is a deep and universal human tendency. Regardless of cultural context, regardless of era, regardless of anything else, human beings wake up from their dreams and ask, "What was that? What does it mean?" Sigmund Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams in 1899, and the cultural impact of that work was enormous and lasting. The central thesis was that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, disguised expressions of repressed desires, encoded in symbolic images. Freud transformed the way the modern Western world thinks about the mind, the unconscious, and the relationship between psychic experience and behavior. From a contemporary scientific standpoint, Freud's specific theories about dreams have received substantial criticism. The idea that every element of a dream is a symbol of a repressed sexual or aggressive desire has not found support in controlled research. But what remains valuable in his legacy is the central intuition: dreams have psychological meaning and deserve attention. Even if the mechanism he proposed to explain them isn't the correct one, the question he asked was the right one. Carl Gustav Jung, who was initially Freud's disciple, held a radically different view. For Jung, dreams weren't disguised expressions of repressed desires, they were direct, symbolic communications from the unconscious, using a language of universal images he called archetypes. Psychic patterns that would appear both in myths and in individual dreams, with a consistency that transcended cultures and eras. The serpent, the hero, the shadow, the stranger, figures that appear in the dreams of people who have never read mythology, but that the myths of every known culture know by heart. In many indigenous cultures around the world, dreams aren't treated as private, internal experiences. They're events that occur in a domain just as real as the waking world, sometimes more so. Among the Akure and Shuar of the Ecuadorian Amazon, dreams are discussed collectively in the morning and carry direct weight in the day's decisions. The dream isn't interpreted as a symbol of something internal to the dreamer. It's treated as information about the external world, received through a perceptual faculty that operates during sleep. Aboriginal Australian peoples developed the concept of the dream time, a parallel and permanent dimension of reality, accessible in certain altered states of consciousness. For these cultures, the Western dichotomy between real and dreamed simply doesn't apply in the same way. The dream isn't less real. The dream may be more real. These systems of thought aren't just anthropological curiosities. They challenge deep assumptions about the nature of consciousness and perception that Western science is only beginning to question seriously. The idea that the dream is merely an internal, private, and externally irrelevant state may be a culturally specific perspective, not a universal truth about what dreams are. There's something that all the facts explored throughout this journey point toward, in their different ways, in the same direction. Dreaming is probably the state in which the human brain is being most completely itself. During wakefulness, the brain is constantly responding to external demands, filtering, censoring, adapting. During dreaming, operating without sensory input and with its critical filters reduced, it produces what it produces when left relatively free. What it produces: absurd narratives, intense emotions, impossible combinations, autonomous characters, threat simulations, silent processing of losses, is a portrait of what the brain considers important enough to keep working on even when no one is watching. Dreams are less a window into the unconscious in the Freudian sense and more a mirror of the spontaneous functioning of an extraordinarily complex system operating on its own terms. Science still doesn't have complete answers to why we dream, what dreams mean, or exactly how they carry out their functions. But what has accumulated over the past few decades is enough to make one thing clear: dismissing dreams as random noise and treating them as mystical messages are equally ways of underestimating something the brain clearly considers important enough to do every single night, without exception, for an entire lifetime. Every human being who ever lived, every person across the full span of the history of the species, on every continent, in every era, regardless of language, culture, belief, or circumstance, spent approximately 1/3 of their life in a state of partial unconsciousness during which the brain generated private subjective experiences, inaccessible to any other being. Those inner worlds existed completely. They were experienced with the full intensity of any reality. And then they disappeared, in most cases without leaving any trace. The total sum of all the dreams that have ever occurred in human history represents a quantity of subjective experience that is, by definition, completely inaccessible. There is no archive, no record, no method of retrieval. Each dream of every person who ever lived existed only for that person, in that moment, and then ceased to exist, taking with it entire worlds that never were, and never can be, shared. Dreams are, perhaps, the purest example of something that exists completely beyond the reach of any observation other than the experience of having them. Universal as a phenomenon, absolutely private as an experience. We all dream. No one dreams another's dream. And as you drift into a deep and restoring sleep, remember to subscribe, so these stories keep finding you, night after night. Sleep well, and sweet dreams.